They put a lien on my 200-year-old family farm and towed my tractors at dawn, all because of an HOA I never even joined. I inherited this farm from my father, who got it from his father all the way back to 1823. 5 generations of my family worked this land before Meadowview Estates started building their beige McMansions next door 2 years ago. The first letter came 3 weeks after they moved in, a violation notice claiming my antique tractors were an eyesore visible from their precious development. I laughed and tossed it. I was never part of their HOA. My farm was here centuries before they poured their first concrete foundation. More letters followed, complaints about my chickens, my barn's paint color, even the height of my corn, each one threatening fines I legally didn't owe. I ignored them all. Big mistake. What I didn't realize was that Karen Wellington, their HOA president, wasn't just some entitled suburban busybody. She was a woman with connections at the county office and a husband on the zoning board, and she had her eyes set on my property. The HOA's harassment escalated faster than weeds after a summer rain. First came certified letters claiming my non-compliance was affecting property values. When I returned these unopened marked "not a member," they switched tactics. 1 morning, I found the HOA president, Karen Wellington, yes, that's seriously her name, standing at my gate with 2 board members. All 3 wore matching polo shirts with the Meadowview logo like some kind of suburban cult. "Your antique tractors are an eyesore," Karen informed me, waving her clipboard. "And those chickens are strictly prohibited." I took a deep breath. "Ms. Wellington, this is a working farm that's been here for 2 centuries. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property." She smiled thinly. "We'll see about that. The county is very interested in improving the area's tax base. Single-family homes generate more revenue than outdated farms." That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules. They wanted my land. Over the next month, Meadowview residents began filing noise complaints about my rooster. Animal control visited 3 times, but left without action since my farm was properly zoned. Next came complaints about offensive odors from my compost pile. The environmental inspector who came out actually laughed when he saw how far it was from their homes. I installed security cameras after spotting Karen's Lexus SUV driving slowly past my property, taking photos. Good thing too, because a week later my footage caught 2 HOA board members trespassing near my barn at dusk. When confronted, they claimed they were just walking on private property a quarter mile from any public path. The real trouble began when I received notice that a petition had been filed to rezone my property from agricultural to residential. The paperwork included digitally altered maps showing my land as part of Meadowview's original development plan. I immediately hired Sarah Bennett, an attorney specializing in property rights. She discovered the HOA had submitted documents claiming I had verbally agreed to join their association when the development was first built. Complete fiction, but it had created enough confusion at the county office to get a hearing scheduled. "They're testing how far they can push," Sarah explained. "They want to force you to sell. I wasn't selling my heritage to anyone, especially not to build more beige houses with decorative shutters that don't actually shut." The next escalation came when they reported my century-old barn as an unsafe structure. The building inspector found nothing wrong but suggested I repaint it to keep the peace. I chose a brighter red than before. Then came the water dispute. Meadowview's landscaping was causing runoff onto a corner of my property, creating a muddy mess. When I built a drainage ditch to redirect it, Karen filed a complaint that I was altering natural watershed patterns. The irony of clear-cutting acres of trees while complaining about my ditch was apparently lost on her. Things reached a breaking point when I received an official-looking document claiming the HOA had placed a lien on my property for $37,500 in accumulated fines and penalties. The paperwork had county stamps, but something seemed off about them. Sarah confirmed my suspicions. The document used outdated county seals and inconsistent signatures. This borders on fraud, she warned. They're getting desperate. I learned just how desperate the very next morning when I was awakened at 5 a.m. by the sound of engines and chains outside my bedroom window. Looking out, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. 3 massive tow trucks were on my property. One was already loaded with my grandfather's 1950s John Deere tractor. Another was hooking chains to my pickup truck, while the third was heading toward my barn, where I keep my modern farming equipment. Grabbed my shotgun, unloaded, but they didn't know that, and ran outside in my pajamas and work boots. "What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" I shouted, keeping the shotgun pointed down. The tow operator jumped, then nervously handed me a clipboard. "Just doing my job, sir. HOA violation removal. Says here you've been notified multiple times. I'm not in your damn HOA. This is private property and you're trespassing." The driver looked confused, then pointed toward the road. That's when I noticed Karen's Lexus parked just outside my gate. She sat inside with 2 board members watching the show. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need officers at 1820 County Line Road. There are trespassers attempting to steal my farm equipment." When Karen saw me on the phone, she got out of her car. "The lien gives us repossession rights," she shouted across the yard. "You should have paid your fines." "What fines?" "I'm not in your HOA. The county rezoning hearing is next week." She smirked. "Better start packing." By now, the tow truck with my tractor was pulling away. I ran to block it with my truck, but the second tow truck had already disabled it. I felt completely helpless watching a piece of my family history being stolen in broad daylight. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Reynolds arrived. Thankfully, someone who'd known my family for years. I showed him my property deeds and explained the situation while the remaining tow operators waited nervously. The sheriff radioed for backup and ordered the tow company to return my tractor immediately. When they hesitated, mentioning their contract with the HOA, he threatened to arrest them for grand theft. Karen was furious. "We have documentation, we have a lien." "Ma'am," the sheriff replied, "these documents aren't properly filed. This property isn't in your jurisdiction, and you know it." As the tow operators began unhooking my vehicles, Karen made a fatal mistake. "This is ridiculous," Karen screamed, her face turning a shade of red that matched my barn. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's on the county zoning board." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? The same zoning board that's hearing your petition next week? Sounds like a conflict of interest to me." Karen realized her mistake too late. She stammered something about misunderstanding the situation and retreated to her Lexus with her minions. But the damage was done. Sheriff Reynolds was now very interested in the upcoming rezoning hearing. As they drove away, I noticed something flutter from Karen's car. A folder had fallen out, probably in her rush to leave. Inside were copies of county documents, including the lien paperwork, with handwritten notes in the margins about where to place forged signatures. "You're going to want to keep that safe," the sheriff advised. "And call your lawyer, now." Sarah arrived within the hour and examined the documents with growing disbelief. "This is beyond HOA overreach. This is criminal fraud." We spent the next 5 days preparing for battle. Sarah filed emergency motions contesting the fraudulent lien. I contacted local news stations about the HOA's strong-arm tactics. My neighbors from surrounding farms promised to show up at the hearing for support. Meanwhile, the Meadowview HOA seemed to realize they'd overplayed their hand. Karen stopped driving by my property. The daily complaint calls to the county ceased. But it was too late. The gears of justice were already turning. The day of the rezoning hearing arrived. The county meeting room was packed. My farmer, neighbors in their work clothes on one side, HOA members in pressed khakis and polo shirts on the other. Karen sat at the front table with her husband, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as several board members whispered in his ear. When my name was called, Sarah and I approached the podium. She laid out our case methodically, the 200-year history of my farm, the agricultural zoning that predated any development, the harassment campaign, and finally, the fraudulent documents and illegal towing attempt. And most disturbing, Sarah concluded, we have evidence that board member Wellington's husband, who sits on this very zoning board, was aware of these fraudulent activities and failed to disclose his conflict of interest. The room erupted. Mr. Wellington abruptly excused himself. Karen began shouting about property values and community standards until the chairperson gavelled her into silence. That's when I presented my secret weapon. During my research, I discovered that my farm qualified for historical landmark status. The County Historical Society representative stood and confirmed that the original farmhouse and barn had already been approved for the registry, making it permanently exempt from rezoning efforts. The chairperson called a recess. When the meeting resumed 20 minutes later, Mr. Wellington was noticeably absent. The board unanimously rejected the rezoning petition and referred the fraudulent documents to the district attorney's office for investigation. But I wasn't done yet. As we were leaving, I approached the HOA members, who looked less smug than when they arrived. I'm hosting an open house at my farm next weekend, I announced. I'd like to invite all Meadowview residents to see what a working farm actually looks like. There'll be fresh eggs, hay rides for the kids, and a chance to meet the chickens you've been complaining about. Some looked embarrassed. Others seemed genuinely interested. One woman even approached me privately. I'm sorry about all this, she confessed. Most of us bought here because we liked the rural setting. We never wanted to drive you out. Karen just convinced everyone your farm would hurt our property values. 2 weeks later, over half the development showed up for my open house. Children squealed with delight, feeding chickens and petting the horses. Parents asked questions about farming and local history. By the end of the day, I had customers signed up for my weekly egg deliveries and produce boxes. Meanwhile, the DA's investigation into the forged documents was proceeding. Karen and 2 board members were charged with multiple felonies, including attempted fraud, filing false documents, and criminal conspiracy. The final blow came when the county recorder's office contacted me. In researching my property's history for the historical registry, they discovered something remarkable. The water rights for Meadowview's decorative ponds and sprinkler systems ran through an easement on my property established in the 1950s. An easement that, due to their harassment and fraud attempt, I now had legal grounds to contest. Sarah negotiated a settlement. I would maintain the water easement in exchange for a public apology from the HOA, payment for all legal fees and damages to my property, and a binding agreement that neither Meadowview nor any future development could ever attempt to rezone my farm again. At the next HOA meeting, now under new leadership, the members unanimously approved the agreement. The interim president, the woman who had apologized at my open house, even proposed establishing an annual community event celebrating the area's agricultural heritage. Hosted, of course, at my farm. A year has passed since the HOA showdown. The farm is thriving, now with a farm stand where I sell produce directly to Meadowview residents. Turns out people actually like having fresh local food nearby. Who would have thought? Karen and her husband moved away after her criminal case ended with a plea deal. Probation and community service. Ironically, her community service hours are being served at the historical society that helped save my farm. The new HOA board is respectful and reasonable. We've established clear boundaries, literally, with a decorative fence they helped. Fund that separates our properties while looking nice for both sides. My farm was officially designated a historical landmark, with plaques explaining its significance to local history. School groups now visit for educational tours. The HOA even features my farm in their marketing materials as a unique community benefit. As for that 1950s John Deere tractor they tried to tow, I restored it completely and now use it to give hay rides during the seasonal festivals we host. The kids from Meadowview love it. The moral of this story: stand your ground when you're in the right, document everything, and never underestimate the power of local connections. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's creating something better than what was there before. And ripe stars, if you've watched until here and enjoyed this story about crazy HOAs, I'd really appreciate it if you could also post some tractor emojis in the comments. Now let's move on to our next story.